The sun hung low over a pristine suburban street, casting long shadows on clipped lawns and white fences that whispered of quiet privilege. Birds had stopped chirping. Curtains barely moved as eyes peeked from half-cracked windows. A black woman stood in the middle of it all, calm, composed, and visibly unsettled, not by fear, but by injustice she'd known all her life. Officer Ryan Callum, broad-shouldered and burning with false authority, jabbed a finger in her face, barking, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His badge caught the light like a blade, flashing not as protection, but as threat. Yet the woman didn't flinch. Her breath was steady, her voice soft but deliberate. "Do you always approach citizens this way, officer?" she asked, her eyes locked on his. The stillness deepened. Children's bikes lay abandoned, and silence became a bystander. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. The power in the scene looked obvious, but it was about to flip, because what he saw as control was about to unravel. What he mistook for trespassing was presence. And the courtroom he thought belonged to men like him, it belonged to her. The morning had started quietly, with dew still clinging to the edges of the trimmed lawns and birds singing in short, sweet bursts before the day's stillness swallowed them whole. The neighborhood looked like a brochure. Perfect. Hedges, mailboxes that matched the shutters, and silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt policed. Judge Aisha Daniels walked down the sidewalk with a purposeful calm, her heels clicking lightly against the concrete, her navy coat brushing against the wind. She wasn't lost, and she wasn't wandering. She was exactly where she meant to be. But, to some, she would always look like she didn't belong. Aisha, mid-40s, black, brilliant, and composed, had carved her way from a childhood in a low-income neighborhood to the federal bench. She carried herself with the grace of a woman who had been underestimated too many times and had learned to let her silence speak louder than any defense. But behind her composure was a deep exhaustion, a quiet ache from constantly having to prove what should have already been clear. Behind her, a low hum broke through the calm. A squad car crept down the street and slowed just as she passed a pristine white house. She paused, not from fear, but from knowing. The engine idled, no sirens, no reason, just the thick weight of suspicion rolling down her back. Then came the door creak and the unmistakable click of the officer's belt as he stepped out, hand resting near his holster. "Ma'am," he called out, voice sharp, chin tilted in unearned authority. "This neighborhood doesn't get many visitors like you." He didn't blink as his words hung there, meant to provoke, to label. Aisha turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Good thing I'm not a visitor," she replied, her tone even, her eyes steady. She didn't flinch, she didn't retreat, and she certainly didn't explain. Officer Ryan Callum, in his late 30s, clean-cut and carrying years of buried insecurity beneath his badge, took another step closer. He prided himself on control, on command, on procedure that masked prejudice. But the woman in front of him didn't fit the usual mold of silence he was used to enforcing. The manicured lawns around them stood as unspoken walls, places where comfort was never questioned and whiteness was assumed. Aisha's presence, poised and unapologetic, cracked that illusion. Callum felt the shift but didn't yet recognize it. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pulled rank. But something in her stillness made him uneasy. Something in her gaze said, "You don't know who I am, but you will." Callum's voice began to rise, each word coated in hostility barely disguised as protocol. "Where exactly are you going? Who do you know here? Why aren't you answering?" His questions came fast, layered, meant to overwhelm, not to protect, but to dominate. Aisha stood still, her face calm, her breath even. His voice rose like sirens. Hers stayed quiet like thunder before the strike. She answered slowly, deliberately, letting silence hang between each reply so he could hear himself more clearly. "I don't answer to aggression, officer," she said without looking away, "and I certainly don't answer unlawful questions." From across the street, a white woman stepped onto her porch, arms folded, expression cold. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her presence was a silent endorsement of Callum's assumptions. Another neighbor held up a phone, camera rolling, already capturing the moment for what it was. Others peeked from behind curtains, some nodding in agreement, others too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. The weight of the moment settled like a storm cloud. Callum's posture stiffened, but his confidence cracked just slightly. "You're not answering my questions," he snapped. Aisha looked directly at him and said evenly, "I'm not required to answer unlawful ones." Her words didn't shake. If anything, they echoed louder than his commands. She wasn't confrontational. She was composed. Her clothes, simple jeans, a button-up blouse, a soft coat, were the uniform of a woman who lived with dignity, not someone out of place. And yet her very presence in that setting seemed to challenge his idea of who belonged. Then Aisha did. Something subtle. She tilted her head just slightly and said, "May I ask you a question now?" The shift was immediate. The officer blinked, thrown off. "Do you always stop women walking alone, or only black ones?" she asked. Her voice didn't change, but something in the air did. The power that had felt so one-sided began to recalibrate. His hand twitched near his belt. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she reached into her purse, slow, measured without fear or apology. Not a single muscle in her face moved as she pulled out a sleek leather wallet, flipping it, open to reveal her federal ID. The gold seal shimmered beneath the morning light. Her voice was cool and steady. "Judge Aisha Daniels, United States Federal Court." Callum froze, the accusation still half-formed on his tongue, caught between shock and shame. The camera phones were still rolling, and now everyone was watching him. The moment her badge caught the light, the street shifted. The badge in her hand didn't shout. It whispered centuries of struggle into a single revelation. Aisha Daniels, federal judge. The very kind of figure Officer Callum thought he commanded with his authority was now standing before him, immune to his tone, untouched by his intimidation. Callum's mouth opened, but nothing coherent came out. I didn't realize," he stammered, voice suddenly devoid of its earlier thunder. Aisha didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch, deliberate and heavy, her eyes never leaving his face. The longer she stood there, the more his posture faltered, shrinking under the weight of his own assumptions. Behind him, the neighbors shifted. Some lowered their phones, their faces softening from curiosity to discomfort. Others whispered, "No." Longer about her, but about him. The control Callum once wielded so effortlessly now felt like sand slipping between his fingers. He tried to gather himself, straightening his back, but it was no use. The courtroom had arrived early, and it stood on the sidewalk before him. "I didn't know," he whispered again, his eyes lowered now. Aisha tilted her head slightly, her tone still even but colder now, like glass under pressure. "That," she said, "was the problem." Her words didn't rise, but they echoed, clear, cutting, and undeniable. She took a slow step forward, not threateningly, but with the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime being misjudged and had finally decided not to explain anymore. "Did it make you feel powerful, stopping someone who looked like me?" she asked. Callum couldn't answer. He couldn't even look her in the eyes. The street, once a quiet suburban sanctuary for control and familiarity, no longer held him up. It held him accountable. Aisha's presence, once challenged, now owned the space. The badge didn't just represent authority. It symbolized truth, survival, and the weight of every silent injustice swallowed to avoid escalation. Callum's hand dropped from his belt. His shoulders sagged. He looked smaller somehow, not because of her badge, but because of the mirror it held up to his character. He wasn't in control anymore. He was exposed, and no apology could fix what he'd just revealed about himself. Without another word, Aisha turned. Her badge remained in her hand, not to flaunt, but as a reminder. Her back straight, her chin high, she walked past him, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The murmurs behind her were no longer directed at her. They were ripples of reckoning. Callum didn't follow. His voice didn't rise. For the first time that morning, he was completely silent. The precinct felt colder that afternoon. Not because of the temperature, but because of what Officer Callum now carried inside him. The walls, once familiar and neutral, suddenly seemed too white, too sterile, like the world he thought he understood had quietly betrayed him. He sat in the waiting area outside his superior's office, knees bouncing, hands clasped together. The memory of the morning played on repeat, her voice, her badge, the way she didn't need to raise her tone to silence an entire street. Fate didn't knock, he thought grimly. It sent her walking down my street. When the office door opened, Captain Renee Holloway stepped out. Mid-50s, firm posture, sharp mind. She had earned every ounce of her authority. Her eyes, however, were not cold. They were measured, disappointed, but not cruel. She motioned for him to come in. As he stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind him like a gavel. "She didn't press charges," Holloway said, walking behind her desk. "But she expects accountability." Her words were precise, heavy, and full of meaning. Callum couldn't look her in the eye. His throat felt tight. Judge Aisha Daniels is one of the key figures reviewing the city's law enforcement misconduct. "Reports this quarter," she added. "You will likely see her again, only next time, in a courtroom setting you're not used to standing in." He nodded slowly, but the shame pressed harder than any reprimand. His mind scrambled for justification, for some procedural defense, but nothing came. For once, there was no shield to hide behind. I understand now," he whispered, the words fragile but real. Silence followed, stretching like a quiet reckoning. The walls around him felt colder, like mirrors that no longer lied. They reflected more than his uniform. They reflected everything he'd missed, everything he'd chosen not to see. The systemic assumptions, the subtle cruelty, the power he'd abused without ever calling it that. Captain Holloway didn't need to say more. Her silence was louder than any lecture. Callum sat there, no longer angry, no longer defensive, just hollow and quietly, deeply aware. The transformation didn't come with a sudden burst of guilt or a dramatic breakdown. It came in the stillness, in the knowing. As he rose to leave, his eyes fell on a poster near the door. Simple text, framed in black. Justice doesn't see color. People do. For the first time in his career, the words didn't feel like a slogan. They felt like truth. And for the first time in his life, he truly saw it. The training room was packed, yet hushed, the kind of quiet that comes not from order, but from anticipation. Rows of officers sat stiffly in their chairs, some leaning back with crossed arms, others leaning forward as if bracing for impact. Officer Ryan Callum sat in the very back, hands folded tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the woman at the front. Judge Aisha Daniels stood behind the podium. No gavel, no robe, just presence. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her story was loud enough. Her eyes scanned the room, not to intimidate, but to connect. When she spoke, it wasn't with fury, but with something stronger. Truth delivered without apology. "I was raised in a neighborhood where sirens didn't mean help was coming," she said. "They meant hide. They meant run. And even now, even with this badge," she held up her federal ID, the same one that had ended a confrontation just days before. "There are days I'm still seen as a threat before I'm seen as a person." Each word was measured, letting silence rest. Between her sentences like punctuation marks that demanded reflection. She speaks slowly, Callum thought, because she wants us to feel what she carries. And he did. All of them did. The room was still, and the usual shuffling and side whispers were absent. This wasn't a lecture. It was a reckoning. "I don't hate you," she continued, her tone even. "But I do hold you responsible, because every time you let your fear be louder than your training, someone like me pays the price." Her gaze passed over the room like a tide, calm but unrelenting. "The badge you wear should never be louder than the heart you carry behind it." The words landed hard. Some looked down. Others nodded slowly. But Callum just stared. Heart pounding, throat tight. The setting, once a place for instruction, now felt like a courtroom, one where no one had to speak to be judged, and no one could escape the weight of what they heard. When it ended, no applause followed, just a collective breath, heavier, fuller. Aisha gathered her things and began walking toward the exit. As she passed the back row, Callum stood. He didn't block her path. He didn't fumble for a speech. He simply said, "Thank you." His voice was low, sincere, stripped of ego. She paused, met his eyes briefly, and gave the faintest nod. That was enough. No forgiveness offered. No apology demanded. Just recognition. And the beginning of accountability. Isha walked out of that room not just as a judge but as something more. A quiet force that had shifted an entire room of men in uniform. She didn't change the world that day, but she cracked something open. And in a system built on silence, that crack was everything. She didn't win the argument. She won the moment that changed everything. Not with a raised voice, not with retaliation, but with calm certainty that truth didn't need to shout to be heard. Justice wasn't served in a courtroom that day. It was served quietly, right there on the sidewalk, in the uncomfortable silence that followed the confrontation, in the cracking of an officer's pride, in the shifting eyes of neighbors who realized they'd witnessed not just a traffic stop, but a turning point. Aisha Daniels didn't just reveal her badge. She revealed a system's blind spot and held it to the light. Have you ever judged someone before knowing who they really were? Have you ever mistaken silence for weakness or presence for threat? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still needs to see the power of restraint, courage, and truth. Because real change doesn't always come from shouting. It often begins in the quiet moments when one voice, steady and unshaken, dares to stand alone. Follow us for more stories where dignity breaks barriers and change begins with one voice.